Hi everyone, today I'm talking about my top 10 most disappointing board games. Now before I get started, I do want to make it clear that this is all my personal opinion, and to be honest, a lot of the time I don't actually dislike these games, they just weren't as good as I thought they were going to be. And again, a lot of the times that's on me because my expectation is something different than what the publisher or the designer intended. But nonetheless, I'll talk through my reasons why they didn't quite live up to my own expectations as I go through them. So let's get started at number 10. So at number 10, I have a game by one of my favourite designers ever, this Stefan Feld game. This is The Castles of Tuscany. Now, The Castles of Tuscany, as you can probably tell by the name, is a kind of a sister game of The Castles of Burgundy, which is a game that I absolutely adore. This one is, however, a slightly streamed back and a bit simpler version that's more card driven as you're drafting cards based on top decking basically, and then cashing them in to take actions, building a bit of an engine, placing tiles on the board and getting bonuses, etc. But for me, when I first saw The Castles of Tuscany being advertised, there wasn't really much information about it before it actually hit the market. My expectations were that this was going to be a similar game to Burgundy, but with perhaps different building abilities and things like that. And when in actuality, it was something quite a bit different with some loose comparisons. And for me, the reason why this didn't quite live up to my expectation was because it was quite light. It was a lot more luck based than The Castles of Burgundy. And ultimately, I thought that the rules overhead of Castles of Tuscany wasn't that much different in comparison to Burgundy, whereas the richness and depth of gameplay in Burgundy was drastically bigger than Tuscany, in my opinion. So for me, it was much more worth just giving that extra bit of effort to learn Burgundy and get a lot more satisfying game out of it than just being content with Tuscany. And for that reason, it never would have hit the table for me, and it didn't really have its own niche and spot in my collection because it was just a bit too light and the gameplay just wasn't quite up to scratch and not what I was looking for. So again, a solid game. I enjoyed my play of it, but not one that was strong enough to stay in my collection, and certainly not one of Feld's best games for me. Next up, I have Between Two Castles of Mad King Ludwig. Now, I'm a big fan of the Castles of Mad King Ludwig, where you are, building your castle, trying to please the king by fulfilling different criteria that he wants. This one, however, was a game where you're placing tiles from a different perspective, really, trying to get bonuses in different ways, and using or drafting tiles and picking one and negotiating with your neighbours about where you're going to place them, because you don't actually have your own castle in this one. You actually share castles with each of your neighbours, and then you kind of work out who's got the best overall building ability at the end of the game. But for me, I found that a lot of the scoring in this game was quite convoluted. It was a bit fiddly. I didn't quite like the look of the game. It was very small, very small tiles with very small iconography that was hard to decipher and look at. Again, the gameplay was fine. It was just a bit lackluster, and it didn't leave me wanting to go back to it, which was a shame because I was expecting a game that was as strong as the original. I love the idea of having to work with your neighbours, because this was actually a hybrid, a comparison, or a mix of not only the Castles of Mad King Ludwig, but also Between Two Cities, and that was a game that also really appealed to me. But I think ultimately it didn't come together as well as I would have wanted it to, and it didn't kind of hold its own place in my collection for that reason. But again, it was fine, just a bit average, and it didn't really do it for me. Next up, at number 8, I have Dominant Species. Now, this is a game I haven't played in quite some time. However, I remember quite distinctly my feelings at the end of the game. So this is a highly regarded area control game, very Euro-esque, as you are basically using one portion of the game to place your workers down, to line up your ability to place things onto the map and manipulate the board to fit your own species so you can thrive and try and hinder other people. But for me, I found the game not only long and a bit dull and boring, I found that the housekeeping in the game was so tedious, where the variables, by just making one change on the board, would just have a whole cascading effect, which I think a lot of people would like. But for me, that was almost impossible to take any autonomy over and to manage your game efficiently. And it just didn't have that fun factor for me, which is a shame because I think when a game, is so highly spoken of, this was considered one of the great Euro interactive games, an area control style game where you have the map and things like that. Game doesn't look great, which doesn't overly bother me, but that ultimately I found it too fiddly. I found it a bit too convoluted. While it did have some things that I did like, in terms of the way that the worker placement spots were resolved, the core gameplay I just didn't find fun. Which is a shame, but I think everyone else I played it with enjoyed it. But again, it didn't do it for me personally, and it just isn't a game that I'll be looking to play again. Next up at number 7, I have another immensely popular game. This one is Five Tribes. Now, Five Tribes is a game I do not dislike. I want to make that clear. I think it's a solid design. This is a Mancala style game, which I really enjoy, as you have this bunch of tiles down on the board and you have meeples on these boards and you're picking up a stack of meeples, dropping them off one at a time, and wherever you land you have the potential to claim that tile for victory points. You have abilities depending on the colour of the meeples you picked up, and you can buy gods and investment to get certain powers and things like that. Lots going on that I really like. The thing I didn't like about this game was the fact that, again, another element of being too many variables and being a bit too tactical for me. So you look at the board state and it's not your turn, and somebody will take an action and they'll obviously take the strongest action, which I think is normally quite apparent. But from then on, you have to completely look at it from a new set of eyes from round to round. And I don't really find that very satisfying when you've got to start and stop, and that much of a strong tactical gameplay doesn't quite do it for me. And that's pretty much what the feeling that I left with this game. It was too many variables at all times and just impossible to map out turns because of the mercy you're at of the other players, which is fine. More of a personal opinion. Again, it has a lot of things that I really do like about this game. I particularly loved the turn order process where you could bid on going before your other opponents do. So that's a really good way of kind of balancing out that mercy of the other players. Because you'd actually have to spend money to go first, but money is going to be your victory points at the end. So that was really nice. But ultimately for me, I said I just liked something a bit more opaque, maybe, just slightly more, and it was just way too tactile and too many variables to keep me interested. And that's why Five Tribes is at number 7. At number 6, I have Azul. Now, Azul, again, immensely popular by a great designer who I tend to love their games, Michael Kiesling. This one is a more abstract style tile game, as you are picking up tiles, placing them on your player board, trying to get line up different combos and things like that. It has this element of when you draft, things go into the middle, and then at the end everyone's drafting from the middle, and you can potentially shaft your opponents with a bunch of tiles that they don't want and can't place, which is going to score them negative points. I can see why people like this game, but for me, I think maybe this was a matter of being overhyped. I didn't play this as quickly as a lot of other people did. The game was already really hyped by the time I played it, and I think because of that and because of all the massive praise it got, I was left underwhelmed and a bit deflated because of it. Because it's a pretty family-friendly, simple game, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes you can have these games that are just mechanically sound but still be accessible. But for me, it just felt a bit flat. It didn't have any real peaks on any moments of excitement. I've always found the decisions quite apparent and obvious to take, at least to be optimal. But again, a pleasant game, but one that I was expecting more from. And a lot of that isn't the game's fault. It's because of the massive praise that it got from a lot of reviewers and players and things like that. So again, number 6, Azul. At number 5, I have Egizia Shifting Sands. Now, Egizia is a game by some of my favourite designers, actually, the kind of Italian conglomerate of board game designers who make Euro games. And Egizia is a re-implementation of a game of its namesake, but it wasn't. It was very much out of print for a long time, and I think because of that, there is somewhat of a rose-tinted glasses looked upon it, where people think this game's hard to get hold of, therefore it's great. It's brilliant. It's one of the original Euro games, one that really implemented that time track mechanism where you can go as far as you want down the river and collect things, but you can never go back on yourself. Mechanisms I love. It has a bit of area control, a bit of set collection, end game bonuses, a lot of things that I really liked. And when I got to the table, I enjoyed it. It was perfectly pleasant. But I must admit, I thought, what was all the hype about? This is very much a game that 1,000 other games do very similar things. Basic area control and things like that. So it was a game for me that didn't really have its own identity. It didn't really raise its head above the parapet in terms of being different than anything else. Just a bit bland, a bit beige for me. And I don't mean that literally. I mean in terms of its identity. And while it's solid, it did nothing wrong. It just didn't excite me, which is a shame because I was expecting so much of it because of the because of that Grail game aspect it had to it. Ultimately, I think it was just a victim of time and became a bit outdated, and the gameplay wasn't as strong as more modern designs, in my opinion. At number 4, I have Reavers of Midgard. Now, the Reavers of Midgard is on this list probably not through its own fault, probably because of the speculation of the gaming community. Champions of Midgard was an immensely popular game, one that wasn't for me, but I could see why people like it. It's a hybrid of American mechanisms and Euro mechanisms. But while I could see that game was solid, but again, not for me, the Reavers of Midgard was kind of being touted as the Euro version of the game, the more deterministic game, the one where you can map out your turns more, with more clarity and accuracy. And when I got this game to the table, there's again a lot of things I liked about it. It had this great card system where you can use cards for different things. Worker placement with diminishing returns if you were to share a spot with someone else. But for me, all the Euro trappings of the game were very much just a casing. It was just it was shallow. And the gameplay itself wasn't as deep and rich of a Euro experience as you might first expect. There's a lot of going to spaces, just collecting cards for in-game bonuses, lots of top decking, and basically, pretty shallow scoring mechanisms without any deep connected mechanisms. And while I like the casing of it a lot more than Champions of Midgard in terms of the actual mechanisms are much more Euro, but the way you gain points weren't very satisfying, and I thought I was expecting a lot more of a rich experience and something that would be more satisfying to your more kind of Euro-minded player. And ultimately, it was a bit too much like Champions for me, but with a different user interface. But again, I don't think the actual publishers themselves really spouted about how Euro this was going to be. It was pretty much just a speculation, and for that reason, it fell a bit flat for me personally. Next up, I have Yamatai at number 3. So this is another Bruno Cathala game who designed 5 Tribes, and I think for me personally, I think maybe this was the game that broke the straw, or the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of Cathala games not being for me. While I really liked Abyss when that one came out, and these games have some similarities, and I thought, these games, I like Abyss, these games are even higher regarded than Abyss is, so I'm bound to like these ones. And a bit like 5 Tribes, this one for me had way too many variables. I thought the gameplay wasn't very fun. A game where you are drafting these tiles and placing boats on the board, trying to surround islands and collecting these tokens to get bonuses and powers, trying to control the regions and things. A lot of things that I really like. But for me, it didn't have that fun factor wasn't there. I didn't really have anything to hook me or to keep me interested in playing the game. It just didn't do it for me in terms of the fun factor, and that's a shame really, because the game looks absolutely stunning. It's a gorgeous looking game. I love the theme. I love a lot of things that I thought it was going to do, but for me the gameplay fell flat. It was stagnant. Again, way too many variables that I couldn't be bothered to rack my brain around because the rest of it wasn't that interesting. Probably an unpopular opinion because I know this is a popular game, but no, I'm just being honest, it wasn't for me. So again, because of the praise and because of the high regard it was in, I was expecting a lot more from Yamatai than what it delivered. At number 2, I have Court of the Dead Mourner's Call. Now, Court of the Dead, this one is based on a kind of comic book intellectual property, and it's very much in the vein of one of those Eric Lang dudes on the map style games. We have a huge map of different regions. You're placing things onto the board to activate those regions, and a real game with great table presence, and it looks fantastic. This game had some drafting where you're drafting these different characters to give you powers and to do different things. You're trying to control these regions in order to, again, get abilities and bonuses at the end of the round. You're using currency to place things on the board. You're trying not to be greedy because it had this death script, or dread script, I think it was called, something like that, where if there were too many people on one spot, then you'd have to roll dice and potentially lose the people on those spots. But you could go to certain spots which could kind of protect you from that. It had a lot of things going on, and I think maybe it was a bit too ambitious in what it was trying to create, because I thought a lot of the mechanisms and the things that made it, or tried to make it individual, didn't really work in practice. For example, there was this tithe you had to pay at the beginning of every round. But if you didn't get didn't meet a particular threshold, then everybody would suffer a penalty. And you had to divide up the different resources at the beginning of the round, which there was no real decision there as well. And for me, the thing that really disappointed me about this one was because with the different regions, there was no lucrativeness or no incentive to go to a particular region over another, or at least not much of one. So if somebody had gone for somewhere that you wanted, you had a more than viable option of going somewhere else and getting not too much of a different reward for doing so. And for me, there wasn't that competitiveness, that kind of rubbing shoulders with other people to try and get to the certain spots. It was a bit too loosey-goosey. The card drafting was very much in the same vein, where all the cards were just fine. There was nothing that you really had to have, and nothing you couldn't afford your opponents to have. So there was no real incentive to hate draft. There was no tough decisions about which of these am I going to have, because you think, I'll pick one, it'll be fine. And that for me was why the game fell flat. I was expecting more. I wanted a game of more intrigue, some more meatier decisions. And for me, it was just paled in comparison to games of the same ilk, really, such as Eric Lang Games' Blood Rages, your Rising Suns. This one just wasn't up to par with those. And it's sad to see, because it would have been nice to see a really solid Court of the Dead game. And finally, at number 1, I have Alma Mater, or Alma Mater. This one is one of by some of my favourite designers, and was pretty much regarded as the second game in the series by, I believe it was Eggert Spiel who published these games. It's a sequel to Coimbra, basically. Coimbra being one of my favourite games, a current top 10 game for me. A game that looks beautiful, gorgeous artwork, great components, as you are kind of the headmaster of this university, trying to get the best students and make your knowledge more valuable than others. I was expecting a lot more than what this game delivered. Probably one of my most anticipated games of last year. Extremely hyped for it, because I loved the previous games. I loved the designers, I loved the theme, I loved the artwork. But the gameplay itself was so mediocre. It was another worker placement game, but that was fine. I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of worker placement in itself, unless it does something tremendously different. But for me, the thing I took away from this game was how much of a slog it was to get resources. It was very, you'd have to jump through a lot of hoops to do basic actions, to get basic character abilities that didn't really do much. There was a bit like Court of the Dead. None of the powers, you didn't really have to have. You didn't feel like that was a really strong one. It was juicy, something that, you could take ownership of and your opponents couldn't have. There was none of that, really. Everything was just fine. Again, a very slow churning game that didn't really have that ramping up effect, no excitement, and ultimately no fun. It was such a disappointment for me, and probably one of the only games from these designers that have ever let me down. And it's sad, because when you really do anticipate games as much as I did for this one, and it lets you down so much, when the next one comes out, you're thinking, I hope this one doesn't let me down like the last one. And once that kind of taint is in the in the waters, it's hard to forget that. Again, not a terrible game, but one that I was expecting so much more from. I was expecting this one to be, an 8 or 9 out of 10, and for me, it was a 6 at best. And I've not really heard a lot of people complain too much about this game, but it's not really taken off either. But for me, it was probably a lot of self-implemented and self-built-up expectations that the game had a hard time living up to. So that concludes my list of my top 10 most disappointing board games. I hope you enjoyed this list. I'm sorry to be negative. I know I don't tend to be overly negative about games, but sometimes it's good to get a balanced view so everything's not overly, always rainbows and sunshine. But if you have enjoyed the video, please hit like and subscribe to my channel and check out my other videos too. Additionally, you can support me on Patreon by visiting the link below and just pledging a couple of pounds a month to keep the channel going. For everyone else, I'll see you next time on Chairman of the Board. Bye.